The second episode of Beyond the Gates, airing on October 13, opens under a thick veil of tension that seems to stretch across the Dupree estate like a silent storm. What appears to be a quiet, uneventful morning soon reveals itself to be anything but ordinary. Behind every whispered rumor, every forced smile, and every carefully chosen word lies a web of secrets waiting to unravel. Loyalties are tested, alliances fracture, and the smallest actions echo louder than anyone expects. In this episode, the shadows grow longer, and so do the doubts that creep into the hearts of those who once trusted one another. The morning in the Dupree estate was painted in a cold shade of gray, the kind of gray that never promised a real sunrise. The air hung heavy, almost too still, as if the entire neighborhood had paused to listen to something no one else could hear. The villas stood in silent alignment, polished and pristine, like carefully arranged chess pieces. But behind those glass facades and white walls, something far uglier was moving, slow, deliberate, and hungry. Naomi stood alone at the tall window of her living room, framed by soft, expensive drapes that did little to warm the air. Her posture was perfect, as always, shoulders straight, head held high, but it was a performance, a fragile attempt to disguise the tremors beneath her skin. She could feel the weight of their eyes. Even when no one was there, their gazes clung to her like invisible hands, prying, dissecting, whispering. The rumors had begun like faint ripples in still water, almost harmless, almost easy to ignore. But ripples always grow when the lake is shallow. And now, everywhere she turned, the whispers trailed her name, Naomi. Pregnant. Uncertain. Dangerous. The question of the child's father had begun to ferment into something bigger than curiosity. It had become a weapon. Danny noticed everything. She always did. Suspicion never came to her like a sudden strike. It crept in, like a thin draft slipping through the cracks of a locked door. It started with Naomi's hands. The way her fingers curled into themselves at the mention of family. Then the way her steps slowed as if she was walking through something heavier than air. Even the pauses in her sentences had grown longer, weighted. To others, these were trivial details. But to Danny, they were evidence. It wasn't about the pregnancy itself. It was about control. Danny had built her sense of safety on predictability, and Naomi's quiet unraveling was like a slow leak in the foundation. It was subtle. But Danny knew subtle was more dangerous than loud. Subtle destroyed from the inside out. And if Naomi was keeping secrets, Danny would find them, not because she needed the truth, but because she couldn't stand the unknown. Across the estate, Leslie entered a room like a blade sliding through silk. She didn't have to speak to make people uneasy. Her presence alone rearranged the air, stole warmth from the walls. Leslie thrived in this kind of silence, controlled, sharp, unforgiving. June sat opposite her, spine rigid, hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles turned pale. She knew what was coming. It was never a question of if Leslie would strike, only when. The affair with Ted had been buried carefully, but not carefully enough. And Leslie was not the kind of woman who let something so delicate remain hidden for long. The betrayal wasn't a rumor anymore. It was a fact Leslie wore like a diamond on her throat. June had once trusted her, shared secrets, confessions, quiet afternoons thick with false sisterhood. That was the cruelest part. Leslie had never truly been a friend. She had always been a strategist. And now, her silence was louder than any accusation. June felt her throat tighten. She had spent months pretending the walls weren't closing in. But here, under Leslie's unblinking gaze, every false sense of security began to crack like old plaster. It wasn't just about Ted. It was about power. And June was standing on ground that no longer belonged to her. Meanwhile, sunlight filtered through the long corridor connecting two wings of the estate, casting stretched, distorted shapes on the marble floor. Nicole stood at one end, Vanessa at the other, once friends, now enemies separated not by distance, but by everything unspoken. There was a time when they moved like sisters, sharing the same air, the same secrets, the same pain. But bonds built on emotion are the easiest to break. They look unshakable, until the first fissure appears. Joey wasn't the reason. He was only the match. The real fuel was years of quiet resentment, of small betrayals never addressed, of trust dying slowly behind smiles. Nicole's eyes no longer saw Vanessa as the woman she once leaned on. She saw a rival. A traitor. Someone who had stolen something intangible long before Joey. Vanessa, on the other hand, wore a mask carved from stone. She understood weakness was fatal now. What used to be affection had hardened into calculation. Every shared memory had turned into a blade, sharp and ready. Donald's story was unfolding in the shadows. His temptation came not in the form of a grand gesture, but in a message, faceless, nameless, almost elegant in its cruelty. A promise of freedom. A life unchained. A clean slate, if he was willing to pay the price. He knew there was no such thing as a clean slate. Offers like that always came wrapped in silk but reeked of rot underneath. Still, he couldn't ignore it. The thought of escape burned quietly in his chest like a fever he didn't want to cure. The fear was real, but so was the hunger. And sometimes, hunger made monsters out of men long before they realized they'd crossed the line. The choices lay before him like two roads in a forest where no birds sang. On one path, safety, a life controlled but familiar. On the other, power, a dangerous beauty. Donnell stood still, paralyzed not by indecision, but by the intoxicating pull of what he already knew he shouldn't want. Night came slowly, as if reluctant to touch the estate, but eventually it claimed everything. In the quiet, in a room too dark for comfort, Shanice stood frozen. 2 phone calls had cracked her world open in less than 5 minutes. One carried Naomi's name. The other, a whisper from a buried past. Together they formed a knot so tangled she couldn't find where it began, or where it might end. Her mind churned with faces, voices, moments she thought were solid but now felt fragile. She had trusted the wrong people before. And now she couldn't trust anyone, not even herself. Every person around her wore a mask. Allies blurred into enemies. Enemies blurred into saviors. The walls of the estate felt closer than ever, like a throat tightening around her. Shanice realized something cruel. She wasn't outside the game anymore. She was in its center, a piece being moved by hands she couldn't see. Naomi wasn't just hiding a secret. Leslie wasn't just calculating. Nicole and Vanessa weren't just fighting over old wounds. Donnell wasn't just tempted. Every thread was tied together in a net designed to trap, not to protect. She could feel the shape of it, invisible but real, an architecture of lies so intricate that if one truth surfaced, the entire structure might collapse. And in that collapse, no one would be spared. The estate had always been beautiful. Its lawns were always green, its windows always polished, its parties always glittering. But beauty meant nothing when the foundation was rotting from within. Secrets don't remain buried in soil this shallow. They claw their way to the surface. As night slowly descended over the Dupree estate, the air grew heavy, almost suffocating. The walls that had witnessed decades of wealth and privilege now echoed with whispers of betrayal. Naomi sat alone in the dim glow of her room, her hand trembling slightly against her abdomen, a gesture filled with both fear and defiance. The questions surrounding her pregnancy were no longer just idle gossip, they had become a loaded weapon that others were more than willing to use against her. Somewhere beyond those walls, Danny was already connecting dots, piecing together fragments of a truth no one was meant to see. Meanwhile, Leslie's cold precision left June shaken. For the first time, June understood the depth of the power game she had stepped into. Leslie wasn't merely exposing a secret, she was orchestrating a quiet war, one in which mercy had no place. Nicole and Vanessa's once solid bond now cracked wide open, their voices raised in accusations that could not be taken back. The night seemed to amplify every harsh word, every broken promise, turning friendship into hostility with terrifying ease. Donnell stood at a crossroads, holding on to the mysterious offer like a lifeline, unaware that every step he took forward only tightened the invisible strings around him. And in the silence of her room, Shanice listened to the last echo of the second phone call, her knuckles white as she gripped the receiver. Two secrets, Naomi's hidden truth and a name from her past, collided inside her mind like a storm with no way out. The Dupree estate, once a symbol of untouchable power, was no longer just a place. It had become a living, breathing labyrinth of lies. And somewhere in the dark, someone had already set the next move in motion. This wasn't the end of the story, it was the beginning of a war no one was fully prepared to fight.